Um, a vast, a vast body of work, a vast body of work which has come down to us as a kind of a classical body of work. The poetry and the prose and the thought. It's a good way to put it overall. The thought of William Blake and how it relates to how are we to question and bring a questing sense to the work of Mr. Blake as a whole, and to ask ourselves, in what degree have we struck at the root as we come to understand it? In what degree? Not well, and of course, when I say struck at the root, this is something I mean only figuratively, because we don't want to harm. We want to provide harbor for. We want to attend to. We want to husband along this growth in the fields of fertile thought. This is how we care for. This is a question or a theme, perhaps, of stewardship. How do we care for the effulgent life form that is the body of work? You could say the psychic body of vegetating growth, of this classical body of work which has come down to us, which we approach. Sometimes we imagine ourselves as we approach this exfoliation of consciousness, this great poetic work, these masterpieces. We are in mind of being in a garden of truth, a garden of life, right? Maybe an amusement park in a certain sense, or perhaps an arcade, or something in the public trust. For indeed, it can be thought of that way, much like before or during the time of when Blake was writing, in terms of his times, during the time of Blake's writing and the time of his imaginative work. And then we can talk about his times, the surrounding situation around him in his society and in his world. What are some of the notions when we ask ourselves, what's the radical nature of his thought? We have to take into account his times. We have to take into account, for example, in vast domains, public power was being parceled out and arrived upon equations of justice and distributed accordingly in such a way as to progressively and to continue to devalue those more organic forms of structural human thought relative to the quote-unquote deeper things in life. It kept on happening throughout the lifetime and the writing time of Mr. Blake, as it continues to do in our time as well. And that is, for example, dominions of property and trust and industrialization and commercialization. The most notable being, and this is a whole other subject practically on a social level, the enclosure laws. There was a time in the village life of England when it was still possible to be aware of what the ancient poets used to be aware of with their enlarged and numerous senses. The ones who were able to go to springs and riverheads and hillocks and certain trees, or places where animals congregated, or contours of line along the land, natural formations, and be able to note with kind of an enlarged imaginative sense the presence of different forms of life than the life of human consciousness, right? The poets animating the landscape with presences. By virtue of what, you might ask? By virtue of the creative imagination, which is the common inheritance of people the world over. And then it came to pass, is the way the story is told, and this is one of many ways it could be interpreted. It came to pass, the enclosure laws, public lands where landless peasants could graze their livestock, so that those without the proper certifications of ownership, of private ownership, would still be able to partake as a source of the common good of nature's bounty, for their own livestock, for their own domestic life, for their own increase, for their own practice of all the village crafts, for their ancient customs where they read by candlelight and learned many languages, taught by each to each. A whole system of education, really. But that's also, that's another story, you might say. But the enclosure laws happened by order of the divisions of the government with their enforcement mechanisms and the local constabulary. The pastures were enclosed and became available only to those who held the largest stake in the sense of landed property in the surrounding area. And so, well, it all went downhill from there, you might say. And then, of course, the industrialization, and for the first time, human consciousness is confronted with spectacles of mass urban life. Well, no, not for the first time. There's always been mass urban life. Always. Babylon named these places. Tyrus, Haifa, some of these cities. Corinth, they dove for the purple dye and the coral off the docks, and then they went back into crowded streets with bazaars and coins and currencies from foreign lands, crowded city streets, and all the problems attendant upon urban life. I'm talking about there, just for a moment, a vision of the urban life of the classical age, of the Hellenic age, for example, out of the wayward and spontaneous memory banks, of the poetic imagination as it comes out of the gates of my mouth, through my terrible teeth, tripping off of my tongue, and hopefully getting back to my original subject matter, whatever that might have been. Oh yes, crowded, teeming urban life, only now industrialized. The red, flashing, flickering lights coming from inside, not outside like a campfire, or anything beckoning at the crossroads to the lonesome eye of a shepherd. No, not even the fires of a forge, of a blacksmith, an archaic and primeval task, so much so that there's the classical god, Hephaestus, who is the paragon of that. But no, blazing fiery furnaces inside of vast buildings, floor upon floor, where in and out file hordes of human souls whose labor is being used to increase the wealth of those who take the most advantage of it, and yet who for themselves receive only the most pitiable amount for such back-breaking work. So you see, the ratios of the shufflings back and forth of human commerce and human interchange. Oh, thank you. Good, thank you. And human life, and hopefully everything I said before was basically audible. Thank you, Eric, for the diagrammatic structuring, which is so important as we interact with these mediums here and now, which basically are all they're doing is picking up the magnetic contours of the spoken word as it is telling you what it's telling you now. Consider this persona of voice. Originally, persona and voice and actor, they all meant one thing. And what was important was what was passing through from the beyond to the ear of the listener. And this intermediary thing, this persona of this, speaking presence, that was kind of like a way station on a relaying road. And so this too is something to consider. Actually that conception is very ancient and is very simple, a very simple and ancient conception. The natural mind is sometimes, at a loss to contemplate these things in its natural memory. But the Holy Spirit has given us ways to overcome our natural human disinclination to intuitively understand, the deeper truths of life. It has given us divine poetic vision, which we can come close to in our own humble way by studying these kind of works, whose value in this light, in this dimension, I intend to show to you now. So, we've established or suggested two things, basically, I believe so far in general terms. The archaically mystical nature of some of the themes in William Blake that we will explore. The archaically mystical nature of the themes, the images, and the structures. Okay? We've looked at that. We could put that, that's kind of like the spiritual dimension. Okay? But let's take it through the medium, of the presentational, fixture that's going on up here right now. Let's take it to this other more outer concentric layer of the circle, and that is the intersection and the way that the work, as any creative work does, always, no matter how hermetic or how reclusive or how remote, in some level, in some way, it is active on the scene in relation to the times, in which we live among others. Because as individual souls, there is this kind of algebraic truth that is so very often overlooked these days, and that is that the times are reflected in each of us in our own unique way, regardless of how large, small, or significant or insignificant is the role we conceive of ourselves playing on the quote-unquote world stage, which is only the construct of a vast commercial enterprise, right? Which I will not name at this moment, lest I fall further into cliche than perhaps I might already be falling. But nevertheless, this is the second domain of the study of William Blake that we're going to undertake. His times, his relationship to his times, and there's this word again, the radical way, the root-like way, he comes to terms with some of the most basic issues that are involved in the life of this tree of knowledge, which he interprets arborer that he is, through his own kind of personal tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You see, there are two trees. This is a key component of, the ancient Hermetic romantic lore, at least for our particular manifestation of it in its continual unfolding, that there are two trees. There is the tree of life, and then there is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They both, in a certain sense, counterbalance each other, and there's so little that I could say about them and so much that I could say about them. Nevertheless, we can simply take it in what I've mentioned of it now and what it seems to evoke shadowly for us even now. We can take that and present it to our thought as kind of a central metaphor to mediate, the two different kind of ways we're going to look at the radical nature of the work of the poet William Blake. We need images such as this. We need structures such as this. What mediates between image and memory, natural memory, image which can be seen either poetically or through the natural mind. It presents itself on the page as it is, regardless of in what spirit you read it. And or memory, this natural feature of the natural mind that is, so laborious. I mean, it is the work that we undertake when we begin to study literature, no matter how sublime or not how sublime. For at least for me, true confessions, once again, the confessional urge is always a certain motive force here. It's just laborious. It is laborious until it comes to the point where the feathers that you've been growing in spite of your best efforts for or against that suddenly begin to move a little bit, and then you feel yourself lifting up off of the ground a little bit, and then you think, and this is what they mean. This is what they mean when the dimension is passed between laborious gathering and the germination of the seed when it comes to the poetic areas of learning and appreciation. This is what they're talking about. But how it prickles as the wings grow. And what are these but growing pains, you might say. This is a Neoplatonic image that I'm kind of like throwing around now. And that brings us, if I may say so as economically as I can, to a particular subset of the spiritual aspect of William Blake's work, and that is the spiritual traditions. And this intersects with the way that he intersects with his times as a mystic, as a spiritual writer, connected to his times in terms of being moved by the injustices that seem to be playing themselves out in relation to the phenomena of industrialization, commercialization, and monarchy, and autocracy, of course, and all of that, and instability, the threat of instability, dangerous revolution across the channel, for example. There is also the creative interaction with his times in terms of the intellectual heritage of his times. And even there is tumult, tremendous tumult, which, as Blake is a precursor for us in this and coming to terms with it, we continue to try to come to terms with it. And that is, the atomic and nuclear age, as Van Morrison put it, or, the rational age, or, the age of the Newtonian paradigm, you could say, or you could say the age of the scientific enlightenment, kind of a French thing, Rococo, you could look at it like that. Rationalism, you could say, the aimless blade of science, as Neil Young put it in that song. I wonder if it might be nice to simply call it rational materialism, but with, all the irony that we can summon whenever we use the word material, or whenever we use the word ism. You're right. All the irony that we can summon, and at various points, as a fallback position, as a default, I might be called upon by a little devil voice inside my mind to use some of these words as a way to get to some other place, some other place, some slip through some hidden dimension, because there is that sense in which, and this brings us to, as well as Neoplatonism, the intellectual traditions, spiritual traditions of his day, Hermeticism, right? The with a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse, kind of folk wisdom kind of stuff, the Johnny Appleseed kind of stuff, but also the Yankee Trader, or that's far afield. That's on the other side of the pond from where Blake is at. No, more like the comic tradition. Let's just put it this way: the carnivalesque. That's received some good attention these days via Rabelais. For Blake is a comic also, and he's a sly one, and he's Hermetic. Oh yeah, the Hermetic tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition, the Hermetic tradition, and oh yes, we intersect again. The radical political tradition, which is so very formative fore and aft in his day. And William Blake's position in relation to that is utterly unique to any radical political thinker of that time, which is one of the other reasons why he is so timeless. And perhaps I can explain what I mean by that. Imagine London, and the Industrial Revolution is happening and all of this, but there is a lively tradition of printing, and printing houses. Well, do I say a lively tradition of printing houses? Is it lively in the sense of like a Renaissance kind of thing? No, not like that, because people don't realize, the monarchy that, under George III, this was also the time of the American Revolution. So it's somehow, I think in any spectrum of political opinion, it's perfectly okay to admit that Britain at that time was functioning in a very autocratic way with laws on the books, very sophisticated laws drawn up by very deep and original thinkers, but the ways that they were being applied by the powerful in the interests of the powerful, of course. And so to have a free press at that time, to be doing books like that, was actually dangerous. Oh, and there's simple and easy proof for that. Perhaps we should continue that a little bit, naming names even. Joseph Johnson, the great printer in London at that time, who was, even though William Blake, wrote, etched, printed, painted, bound, sewed all of his paintings, all of his works, all of his poems himself. Thus, every artifact upon which his text is written has been touched and made by his own hands, and then given to us, to inherit. For all of that, he still had connections with this printer, this radical printer, Mr. Joseph Johnson, among whose circle, among whose fortunate coterie, among whose inspired enclave, was William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mr. Priestley, Mr. Holcomb, for a time, Thomas Paine. These were the radicals that I'm talking about. We need to consider Thomas Paine a little bit. There's a great story about that, connected to William Blake, as a matter of fact. Yes, so those radical political circles at that time. Perhaps to jump into that fascinatingly as it is, consider Thomas Paine. We have all considered Thomas Paine and everything, but we don't really. He is a little bit different than all the others. He was a bit of a bohemian, in a real sense, and he owned no land here that I know of. Like I say, it wasn't kind of a landed gentry thing, nor was he a merchant in a sense. He was a journeyman. He was a writer. He was a journalist. Was he a controversialist? Yeah, I think so. Actually, I will make that judgment. Was he a publicity hound? In a flippant note, I might say that, and I would offer verification of that in the controversies that did surround him. That he must have, in a way, been drawn to them somehow. His writing style actually reflects that, with this kind of clash, this really red-hot clash of ideas, which was, I guess, that was the inspiration that you could draw for your writing from the times around you at that time. People still continue to do that, but I don't think they do it as creatively. I think it's a much less spontaneous thing, though no less, unstable for that, right? But nevertheless, Thomas Paine, was English and stayed in England until he was 38. And if we are to tell the story the way it is commonly told, he was a failure. It is easy to talk about these kind of stories about these kind of people, to speak in these extreme terms of failure and making good and humble beginnings and later fame. And these are some of the we can critically see some of those storytelling tropes in a way that I think that would help us in our understanding of the actual trajectory of the growth of the soul, if we pay attention to the different style of storytelling practiced by those such as William Blake. Nevertheless, Thomas Paine came to Philadelphia with the mentorship or the fortunate connection of Benjamin Franklin, where he found himself a job writing. And I could be wrong. I don't know if it was exactly newspapers at the time. It was pamphlets. There was an appetite for that at the time, and it's a stylistic, it's a lesson on style. The way a pamphlet is, evidently we've come to appreciate that in our Western tradition, as it's well suited. It was well suited at that time to the polemical style, polemical brochures upon the issues of the day, and if they were not going to work unless they were exciting, right? And so naturally, there was a lot of hacks. There's a lot of hacks, and there's a lot of specified ways to reach that level of discourse where you get that kind of reaction based on what the fish you're biting on, so to speak. But Thomas Paine, for all of that, maybe he was, but he was of another level also. Not only had he truly an inspired way with the phrase, but he also had some kind of inner understanding, yes, some kind of divine vision, some kind of poetic apprehension of the actual nature of the issues at play in terms of a human cause, a conception of the good with enough applicability to the problems of the day and the times to offer a way to envision a hope for a world, a society that would work better for everyone involved. You could not be an urban dweller at that time anywhere and not look out the window and see vast differences of wealth and well-being. And the response to that from the poetic imagination found itself expressed under the pen hand, the writing hand of Thomas Paine in America. And it found like a spider, it found its way to connect its web, to build and to take hold, and then to continue to express, during critical turnings of the age, and during the time of the American Revolution, of course, for example, and his pamphlet Common Sense, which laid it out in such a way that the conceptions of the people were inspired, truly. Excited, yes, but that's always happening. But inspired, yes. Well, but how can you quantify it? Well, you cannot quantify it. You can only interpret it. And yeah, it's probably all downhill from there. Nevertheless, it continued after that, though, so much so that there was some kind of periodical of pamphlets he was putting out called Crisis, I believe it was. And there was evidently, kind of like when Camus in occupied France was writing Combat, though let us not make the mistake of the inflexible template and draw the same romantic arc between Albert Camus and Thomas Paine. It could be good to do that just to kind of fix it in our mind and increase our appeal a little bit, but I don't want to promulgate that, I would rather just say that, yes, the fact is, Crisis, this periodical pamphlet was met with by a reception in the public, in the mind of the people, at a critical point in the American Revolution when things were not looking so good. And Paine's writings came to the people, even the soldiers, in such a way that it is said that George Washington gave orders that his troops be read pages from Thomas Paine, And so there is that, it's kind of a subterranean, so to speak, rivulet in the history, of the history of an idea, of a social idea, right? Or really, actually, of a creative idea engendered in the human spirit, related through the medium, the skillful deployment, and the skillful and inspired expression of thought into words that later generations interpret history and come to recognize it as having had a significant role. Would Thomas Paine have wanted that? Yes, I know he would have, because he was always injecting himself into controversies, right? And would he understand the way that I'm appreciating it right now? Yes, I believe he would, but we cannot quantitatively understand that, at least at this moment. But anyway, after the successful outcome of the American Revolution, the composition of the Constitution, its process through a structured kind of group consideration of, an assembled gathering with the intention of putting together a charter that would serve as the philosophical basis for the legal structure, a way to share power in, a newly formed government, and all of this. After that, Thomas Paine, the role that he played was as an inspirer and as a sort of kind of a on-the-ground explainer and one who rang the bell in a clear way, you might say. But he wasn't involved, he wasn't any kind of a politician. No, he was in England soon after the revolution was won. He was in England, and he stayed in England, and he wrote in England, he wrote another, this is, I think, a longer thing, longer than a pamphlet, and it's called The Rights of Man, I believe it is. Yes, The Rights of Man, in which he aligns himself with the radical politics of those such as Godwin and Wollstonecraft and Priestley and some of these other revolutionary thinkers. And he calls for the overthrow of the crown, radical words. And he's able to be around for a little bit. But yeah, as I mentioned, England under George III, and especially at that time, was a place where espionage-ish bad things could happen. The story is told that at this reading circle, with Joseph Johnson and Wollstonecraft and Godwin and others, William Blake was there. Yes, William Blake was there. And Thomas Paine was there. And I guess Thomas Paine was driven to articulate his views in this really kind of dramatic life and death kind of way. and as I said, it was this drama that he generated which benefited him so stylistically. These are the times that try men's souls. That phrase comes from him, for example. These are the times that try men's souls. Okay, but now, well, what would you say about that? It's a dramatic statement, but it's not always true. And if it is true, it might be good to write more about the soul and the ways in which it is tried in other ways. But instead, Thomas Paine being a journalist, and a fist-pounding orator, he's talking about more like the inflammatory social issues. And so he's holding forth at some point, and the story is told that it is disputed by some, but it's not widely disputed. It was told in William Blake's first biography by Gilchrist, who, well, that's another story, but William Blake stood up at the conclusion of Thomas Paine's talk, where he evidently said things inflammatory, and just said to him, "Don't go home." Thomas Paine lived in London at that time, as did all of the others. "Don't go home. Go to France. It will be death for you if you go home." And then William Blake left the room, and Thomas Paine from Dover, he left for France. It is said that William Blake warned Thomas Paine that the fuzz were coming after him, and Thomas Paine got away because of that. So there's some subterranean radical lore for you. Never, it is known that they did know each other, and William Blake moved in those circles, and it's great, right? But what's more interesting, actually, to me, is the way William Blake interacted with the radical ideas that were being shared at that time. This gives us an insight into William Blake's unique stylistic character as an inspired thinker. He would assimilate these ideas. He would react against them in all of these kind of like witty ways. He would make notes that were oftentimes marginalia, then that he would later like make into quips that he would engrave in his books. And in this way, he was able to enter into kind of like a poetic dialogue, of course, one-sided, because he's using it to generate his own ideas. He's responding to these ideas by assimilating them, using them, as he put it, later on in a slightly different context. Desire is there for reason to build upon. So what William Blake did, he wasn't there to become a statesman, to seize power, to write a legislation piece, or to get the next journal assignment. He was there to feed upon the ideas, and then to recollect the ideas creatively in his own way, so as to build up his own corpus of creative mythological thought. For, as he put it, he said, "I must create my own system," speaking mythologically, "or be enslaved by another man's." And so this was his interest, and this was his aim all the time. He was like a thief in the house of love, right? He was working as a poet and a craftsman, but at the same time, he was not furthering any kind of like social or ideological agenda in that particular way. He was creating. He was creating out of the inspiration of his own imagination, his own poetic imagination. And yet it couldn't help but to reflect in itself as a theme all the themes of injustice, in his day, and the pressures of urban life. And let me also add, this is part of what we know to be true about William Blake. He was a solitary figure. In many ways he was friendly, kind of eccentric and everything, and sometimes could be sharp or playful in kind of an unusual way, but he was respected by those who understood. But by many others he was considered mad, and he moved in other circles too, because he was more of a working class kind of existence than those other radicals were. He was a printer and an engraver and a painter, and he had to deal a lot of times in a most demanding and rigorous way with the business aspects of his day. Enough so that but it was also part of the way he was and the way he did the business side of things, that he essentially lived in poverty, but he maintained, though in a more kind of pragmatic way, his connections with the people and the galleries and the fixtures and the places and the institutions, very not major institutions, but that could support his work. And he had connections which kind of would help him sometimes in that way. But no, he lived a life of poverty, which is part of his, that's why his poetry is the way it is. I don't want to compare it actually in any kind of haphazardly and cliched way with other kinds of romantic poetry, because I don't want to seem to be contrasting it in a way that would put down that other poetry. But instead, I will say, consider like his vignettes, his depictions of, for example, of urban life, of nocturnal urban life, and consider what kind of world that he's presenting and the terms that he's making for us to consider it in, and how contemporary, how absolutely contemporary it is, not only for what it depicts, but for what it leaves out artistically in terms of what we're used to. That's also really wild and important. But so I wander, London. I was talking about urban life, right? Crowded urban life, poverty of urban life, the threat of autocracy and the autocratic rules that are imposed from the crown, imposed on high upon the people who are only trying to make a living. And so this is London. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry. Every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now, why is that so contemporary? Well, it is so utterly vivid in the imagination, and yet, where is there a reference to any specific concrete thing that you don't see or hear or understand now? Right? He's not talking about, stagecoaches, or trolleys, or even cobblestones. When he talks about things, what kind of things does he talk about? He talks about manacles. Manacles, we know what those are. I don't know if we've ever seen them. He talks about mind-forged manacles. Mind-forged manacles. We know exactly what he means. And yet we've never seen them with our eye. And he hears them, though. In every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. In every voice, in every band. The voices are crying, the voices are cursing in this poem. The voices are silent. The marks of weakness, marks of woe. And then when he talks about the chartered streets, he's talking about a binding through a boundarying, a bordering that is oppressive to the basic nature of the flowing of human consciousness. See what I'm doing? I'm making squares. I'm making squares that are there not to be following any intrinsic aesthetic design, but to follow a notion in a grid of form and functionality. Form and functionality. And this is the boundaried space that he is living in. Imagine the insight of that, at the same time seeing the goodness of what was once a common before it was enclosed under the enclosure laws. See, this is what we're talking about. So another thinker might concoct a theory, and that's okay if that's your destiny as a creative being to work on in that level. But instead, William Blake is called upon to create an utterance that reflects in the eyes, through the eyes, of not only a human being wandering through night streets, but an imaginative visionary seeing into, with a real insight into the actual nature of things around him, and expressing it in ways that might seem stark or striking or bizarre. And here we are, more than 200 years later, finding great value in it. Is this not art? This is art. So let's continue to study it. So as a thinker then, because, okay, poems are great. They gave us everything we are. They're keys and doorways. And yet, at the same time, a thinker such as William Blake, an artist such as William Blake, helps me, at least True Confessions once again, to continue to understand something I seem to want to need to know about a certain kind of aesthetic mystery, and that is this, that poems are thoughts, just as songs are thoughts, and even paintings and other things too. These things are thoughts. But it's not enough to just say it that way. We have to ask ourselves, okay, what order of thought? What kind of thought? What dimension of thought? What makes, a thought a poem one moment, and a thought another moment, a rabble-rousing, half nonsensical, non-bon mot. What's the difference between those two things? Well, it's a question of inspiration, of course, and William Blake enacts this question of inspiration in a tremendous variety of literary forms, not just poems, but dialogues, phrases, marginalia, thoughts, legends, like the legends that we tell about him. Whether or not they're apocryphal or not, they give us an image of the man. And as such, an image of the man on the level of the natural mind, but an image of the presence on the level of the visionary mind. And it is the impact of his presence there that is the primary responsibility of the poetic seer to come to terms with. And I only say that because the more you grapple with, or wrestle with, or put yourself through the tedious mill of coming to understand the work of William Blake, the more you come to realize, that these kind of issues are what is happening. Nevertheless, understanding, we've mentioned the laboriousness of it. Understanding, we've mentioned the organic nature of it. Understanding, we've mentioned the processes by which we work with it and cultivate it in ourselves as sensitive readers. Understanding is the word that I'm talking about. And then we ask Mr. William Blake, as the next step in our questioning quest, we ask Mr. Blake, so understanding, yes, as it says in the scriptures, with all thy getting, get understanding. Understanding, working root-like, foliage-like, trunk-like, atmospherically, terrestrially, cosmically, celestially, meteorologically, cultivating, husbandrying, stewardshiping, understanding, working in all of that. And then what does he say? Well, I see him looking up, through the misty dust, and he says, understanding, well, I can't do a Cockney accent. If I begin to try to imitate William Blake, I'll sound like Mick Jagger, badly imitated. So let's just get to the gist of his meaning, which is actually the visionary thing that's really going on. He says, understanding can never be told so as to be understood only and not to be believed. William Blake says, I paraphrase only slightly, Understanding can only be told so as to be understood. Understanding can never be told so as to only be understood and not be believed. Understanding can never be told so as only to be understood and not be believed. If it was any longer, you could turn it into chopsticks on the piano. But basically what he is saying, I can present you with images, or no, I can present you with thoughts, or whatever. Thoughts are images, and images are thoughts, and between them we have natural memory with occasional visitations, of imaginative vision. But understanding itself can never be presented so as to be just understood only. It's not enough. It must also be believed. Understanding can never be only understanding. It must also incorporate itself as belief. Incorporate itself as belief. Just as we, as spiritual emanations of God on high, only come to consciousness of ourselves as limited beings, individual limited beings here in the world of time and space. It's the same thing with understanding. Understanding must be presented to the sensual eye of the fleshly mind so it can be taken in as belief as well as understanding. And then we ask ourselves, we're blown back, like a typhon, a typhoon. On what basis then? Is belief to be claimed or understood or shepherded or guarded or hoarded? Certainly not. Or accessed or made deliverable or expressed. And that is where we return to the poetic imagination, which, like the voice of God, is its own kind of authoritative statement. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Did the light believe? Did the light believe? And that is why the light came to be in the command of God's voice? Did the light believe? That is a question I cannot answer, because the light itself, with this divine principle, as part of its very being, as uttered by the original voice of the divine presence, which said, "Let there be light," this light came into further manifestation, farther into the world of time and space. This light became, for example, most primarily in the world of time and space, the sun. The sun, the eye of time and space, the central pivot around which all of the mystical understanding of the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, as well as the cyclical understanding of agriculture and the rising and falling of the flooding of the Nile, and the knowledge and awareness that built the pyramids, all these were further manifestations of that original utterance by God of "Let there be light." Further manifestations of form, farther and farther into time and space. Farther and farther into time and space, and density, and fragmentation, and confusion and frustration, where, unlike the primordial times when truth and the soul were one, now things have to be put into terms of other things. Images must convey inner meanings. Memories must be pondered and considered. Religious symbols must be meditated on in order for them to yield their meanings, or in order for them to reveal or bring forth their more original source essences. This is the work of the artist. This is the work of the one who labors in the fields of imagination, whose work William Blake is a continuing encourager of. These are some of the themes. So on what authority then for him to say that and to see all those things? It's divine image, it's poetry, it's the divine imagination, so it is only too natural for him to bring it forth as this utterance. Hear the voice of the bard. Hear the voice of the bard who? Hear the voice of the bard who past, present, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees. calling the lapsed soul, and weeping in the evening dew, that might control the starry pole, and fallen light renew. O earth, return, arise from out the dewy grass. Night is worn, and the morn rises from the slumberous mass. Turn away no more. Why must thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore, is given thee till the break of day. Hear the voice of the bard. This is belief being created for the mind, not as a spectacle by which to be entertained, but as a realization to be made available. That is what makes the voice of the bard the voice of the bard. But I also notice, firmly entrenched is the bard, as he must be, because he is all of us. Firmly entrenched are we in the world of time and space. So much so that some of the emotions that are going in and out of here, along the analogic road, well, for example, now I notice it's an appeal for the sun to rise. Well, or is it? Yes, it is. It's also an appeal for the earth to rise. Yes, the celestial bodies in the work of William Blake, his understanding of their different forms and movements and harmonies and outlines he is so steeped in that in the simplest of terms he can evoke them. Turn away no more. Why must thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore is given thee till the break of day. He's saying to night, night. It's an appeal, night. He's saying it's an appeal to earth. Earth, turn away from night toward us. So it's a knowledge of the motion of the sun, even though on first glance it looks as if it could have been written by a prehistoric shaman. And yet it includes within itself the fact that when you're talking about a turning and a turning away and a turning from, you're talking about something that manifests itself in all these different kinds of cyclical kind of ways upon the earth. And because your enlarged senses have only to, just like Whitman, the child that went forth every day, everything he saw, he became that thing. William Blake, actually, he's tougher. He's more thick-skinned, I think. First of all, because he is using artistically, using craftsmanly, but also speaking through on a higher level, these persona, the bard, for example, and these other things. And so this gives him more ways to convey it in more archetypal terms, because he is connected to that archetypal world. He does make a distinction between the natural world of time and space in which we truly are, but he is very effectively vehement in saying, but that is not all that there is, nor is it any less than what we bring to it as we live inside of ourselves as beings who are aware of our origin. Anyway, so what can the poet do but continue to record the continuation of this dialogue between the voice of the bard and the earth? He writes, Earth's answer. Earth raised up her head from the darkness, dread and dear. Her light fled, stony dread, and her locks were covered with gray despair. Prisoned on watery shore, starry jealousy does keep my den. Cold in horror, weeping o'er, I hear the father of the ancient men. Selfish father of men, cruel, jealous, selfish fear. Can delight, chained in night, the virgins of youth and morning bear? Does spring hide its joy when buds and blossoms grow? Does the sower sow by night, or the plowman in darkness plow? Break this heavy chain that does freeze my bones around, selfish, vain, eternal bane, that free love with bondage bound. So, the sun gives heat. The heat of the sun and the actions of the sun in a physical sense have physical consequences, physical results, bring forth physical manifestations that have further consequences and results by its heat. But the sun also is of light, and it is the light of the sun then that in William Blake's archetypal world becomes a light as if shining through a keyhole and landing upon a certain selected place in some inner sanctum of consciousness where reside the archetypal spirits or the poetic manifestations of the sources of all of our human emotions, which are part of the demand we make upon ourselves in this world to be worthy of the inspiration that we feel somehow to be a part of us, which we are made aware of as if coming from a world we cannot see with our eyes. And yet when we see through our eyes, we come to a greater understanding of this world and the ways that we can express it and come to appreciate it and come to listen to it through the creation or the appreciation of all the different, of the works of art that constitute the body, the poetic body of this work. All right, so that being said, what have I left out? Oh, yes. Here's what I need to say. There is another element that I mentioned, that an element or a kind of a way to understand that I think is something that William Blake can help us to understand in terms of our contemporary times, both socially and archetypally. And that is in this way. Just consider this, just this basic thing. So many of the ideas and things that I've been throwing around or suggesting, I'm not sure, how clearly or not. But, okay, what kind of a literary world, I ask you, might these be generalized as? Might it be coming from, might it be referred to as? Okay, well, I mentioned one thing, romantic poetry, political pamphlets, public pronunciations, and, ratios of justice and histories, and things of this nature, ideas, social kind of aspects, But what about this other social/cultural form another way by which ideas are handed down from age to age? Okay, in one of William Blake's little books, I say little books, yes, little books, because you can hold them in your hand, just like you can hold infinity in the palm of your hand, just like you can hold eternity in an hour, just like you can see the world in a sunflower, right? Just as you can do these things. But what about this form of cultural transmission? Yes, and so in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he beholds the infernal printing houses. The infernal printing houses made by those counterparts to the angels, the fallen angels. What does angel mean? Angelos, but messenger. And for William Blake, they play this very comprehensive and at times comical and very dramatic part of his dramatic kind of poetic theology. But just to put it in blunt terms, he sees the infernal printing house and he sees the devils working, and in so doing he sees the books as they are etched in the corrosive acids, and he also simultaneously knows that he is witnessing the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation along these infernal means. For the sake of hyperbole and drama, let me myself say, oh yes, we've entered the realm of the infernal hermetic. We've entered the realm of the secret knowledge. We've entered the realm of the devilish printing houses. We've entered the realm of the intuitive ideas, that are expressed oftentimes by the renegade figures in the dramas, sometimes even by the defeated figures in the cosmic dramas. We are looking at the forms of knowledge that are passed down, not necessarily through the official ecclesiastical scriptures of the established statist religions, nor the well-known and vetted academic tomes of the time, nor the scientific documents and doctrines and resultant experimental records. We're not talking about that form of cultural transmission. We're talking about something more sinister. We are talking about the hidden diabolical knowledge. Okay, that's fun to talk that way, but only for a while. I want to say that you can look at Blake as an occult thinker. Occult. All I mean by occult is occluded. All I mean by occluded is dark. All I mean by dark is that which is contrast to light. All I mean by that which is contrasted to light is the line as the edge of the silhouette, with the extreme contrast between light and dark, or any other dramatic polarity you want to put to it. It's a good way to conceive and continue to try to understand something imaginatively and not be, not be bored with it, but to make it into kind of this kind of dramatic, kind of forbidden thing, almost this infernal thing. But I want to even take a step farther than that. Well, first of all, I want to say really quickly, William Blake himself, he would say, fine, if I want to refer to him as an occult thinker in this way, he would say, fine. But he would say, but if you can't take it very, very seriously, because really what William Blake is, he's a mystic. And here is how a mystic and an occult thinker are not the same thing. The occult thinker has their eye on the door, on the solid door, sometimes on the doorknob. The occult thinker is looking for the mechanism or the way to work his or her will upon the external things in order to make that hinge open up to grant entryway through the threshold into this kind of thing that is denied to his rational mind. But what about the mystic? The mystic is not chained to time and space in that way. The mystic does not look at knowledge as being something apart from his or her own inner self. The mystic cultivates the awareness that assures him or her that this is the case. Nevertheless, all of us who are devotees of literature are both occultists and mystics. Why? Because you got to learn the stuff, the mass, the stuff, the lore, the legends, the words, the places, the names, the dramas, enough so that a certain muscle is developed. As Thomas Edison said, genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. And a great way to perspire is to go wading, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, through many forgotten volume of arcane lore, or as Thomas Burton in his magnificent book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, delineates for us the different kinds of obsession that the nocturnal scholar of forgotten fields is subject to in a very humorous and healing way. But at the same time, we know that it is a gift to see the past and the present and the future, to see heaven in a wildflower, or eternity in an instant, or to see a world in a grain of sand is not something you sweat your way toward. Consider the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor spin, and yet look at God, how God cares for them and dresses them in the raiment more splendid than that of Solomon and all his riches. So, both of these polarities do exist. Nevertheless, what I want to say is I want to go from that into a statement of genre. You know what I think? Here's what I want to say, speaking of our own times, and I've been inspired to try to formulate this by attentiveness to the concerns of William Blake, which are so full of insight and integrity, so much so that it has occurred to me as I look out at our times, a certain way, maybe it's obvious to anyone else, of course, but a certain way that the demagogic appeal, here's what I want to say about the demagogic appeal, which has always been with us. The demagogic appeal has always been with us, so much so that there are famous demagogues, named demagogues, perhaps I should say, in the works of, in the dialogues of Plato. And in classical, there are lots of them. And they have their own role to play as dramatis persona, demagogues. But what is it? One thing about a demagogue stylistically is it's only hard to admit when you first admit it. It's like when you've generated static electricity and you touch something metallic. It only hurts for just that moment. Demagogues, by nature, have to be effective improvisers. The implication being that a demagogue is a practitioner of a certain kind of art form. But evidently now, the nature of this art form, there's no top and bottom to it. Is there now? There's no top and bottom to the art of inspiration, because you can make up stuff. You can make up true stuff, and you can make up false stuff. It's all in the intention, I say. It is all in the intention. It is all in the intention with this qualifier. So is everything else. Intention is everything, and so is everything else. And you heard it here first. But there's no top and there's no bottom to the art of inspiration. The demagogue is there to search for the bottom. The suspense and the sinister negative magnetism of the demagogue is that the bottom keeps going down, 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 down. Okay, so but the main thing is the improvisation is the vehicle by which the energy, the mental energy, good or bad, for whatever purpose, for whatever intention, is delivered through the medium of spoken improvisation. All right. Of course, it oftentimes relies on very uncreative kind of tropes, and stratagems and tactics and things and suggestions, of course. And some of the techniques of that kind of prestidigitation are easily learned and crudely taught and practiced, oftentimes in negative moral contexts, of course. Nevertheless, so improvisation is a feature of the essential skills of the demagogue. But there is something more, and this is what I wanted to say about occult literature. There is, a submerged and hidden and underground stream of creative and inspired thought coming to us through the, neglected Hermetic tomes, the symbolic works, the alchemical texts, the things that commercial taste blessedly does not see, so that, yes, it flies under the radar, so to speak. But the nature of such literature is it's the parameters by which it is to be interpreted and understood or wilder. It's wilder. It's from a wilder kind of terrain, a wilder kind of dimension of cultivation, unquestionably. So much so that, as William Blake knew too, or anyone who seriously is interested in the poetic reality of this, to study it, it teaches one how to regulate the interpretation of it in such a way as to benefit one's mental health. But that could be a too literal way to put it. But nevertheless, the boundaries are organically applied and learned in use. And I think that's a specific way to put it. But then there's this other soup, this other swimming body of lore which seems to touch on, through things and images, similar archetypal realities, but it's, more protean in a more negative kind of way, and it is stock in trade of what the demagogue draws upon. So specifically, I would be talking about the various myths of nationalistic origin, the various nationalistic myths which are themselves, not always, not even most of the time, but a very significant part of the time, they are further transformations of tribal myths and things of this nature. And they become part of these ongoing and highly magnetized and highly charged kind of narratives, and they're called up. It's a body of occult literature of a certain kind, right? Nativist myths, and think of for example, the satanic mills of reasoning, so to speak, specious reasoning, of course, that became the body of nefarious work known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and how in its moving wheels of association it brought in many other kind of like images to which were connected thoughts, which people still had an attraction to be molded and shaped into this statement, which, had this obviously deleterious effect. But what we see about it is that it is a certain body of literary materials, of legendary materials, to put it more so, called upon in all the various cultures, times, and ages and ways by demagogues all over to create these fictitious narratives so as to bring about deleterious effects upon cultures and upon societies and upon individual psyches and upon principalities and powers and towns and places. And so the language of paranoia, then. The title of Richard Hofstadter's book, The Paranoid Tradition in American Politics, like many a well-remembered book of political insight or political analysis, the title tells you a whole lot. The Paranoid Tradition in American Politics, because you kind of just know what he's talking about right away. But this is just a further exploration of a certain kind of style. A paranoid style has its own kind of occult, body of knowledge, as well as it has its own kind of entry points and journeys through and ways that you come out, because it is still kind of an analogic kind of reasoning. And so this is another way it has all these trajectories kind of going out into the society. I hope I'm not expressing this as a way to materially understand it or to think that, seeing it this way will help us to stop it. I don't think that I offer any kind of insight or advice on that. No, it's more like, this is what's going on, and as I see it, part of the arts of democratic citizenship are now to, be open to the inspirations that can come to one when one is discovering or learning to become more aware of that inner faculty, that inner compass, which says, okay, what is true and what is not true, and as far as possible from any kind of operational or practical understanding of it, as I am, my only hope is that by expressing this thought, I can kind of allay some of my own distress when I contemplate what's happening. Well, and of course, what has always been happening to the well of shared, insight and language in society. But that it is writers such as William Blake that are turning my thoughts in this direction to help me kind of achieve this kind of understanding, which we'll see what kind of meaning it has. So let me take a quick journey into, just for a moment, and let me check the time here in this world of time and space. Yeah. Okay, William Blake is an occult thinker. I'm going to say this is where it begins and ends, as a story that I'm telling. And it begins with me trying to delineate a certain kind of body of symbols that are operative on these, pre-rational, proto-perceptual levels. And, okay, how about, unlike another dimension that William Blake is so very healing on, is his understanding of, his critique of, his insightful view of the religions of materialism, the aimless blade of science, all this kind of thing. I don't exactly have that much time to go into that. But he offers a corrective. Okay, let me say this. It seems that so many times, this is true with Camus, in the arc and the trajectory of any kind of activist or idealist, they enter into like the world, and the world is a better place. And it's been this way since the French Revolution. That's a whole other story too. The French Revolution, with its all of its ideals and the language in which those ideals were expressed. By the way, French Revolution is also the place where Thomas Paine wrote a defining book, not necessarily about the French Revolution or revolutionary politics in general, but actually about the very thing that I'm talking about, deism. As William Blake would put it, the materialistic religion of deism. The deism where it was kind of a rearguard action. It was a reaction against, actually, well, it was a reaction against a lot of things. It was a reaction against, Newtonian physics and the way this seemed to demystify the old loaded, dogmatic splendors and ways of understanding the world. It was also in reaction to, the scientific enlightenment. It was an outgrowth, I should say, of the scientific enlightenment and the whole new conception of society that offered. And also as a way, technological advances and all of this, but also as a way to be freed of priestcraft, freed from oppression, religious oppression, the superstition of the official statist entities that control access to supernatural reality. Well, it was a kind of a tone of freedom when deism came to be formulated, where yes, God was accepted, but as a rearguard action, all the other things that were objectionable to the new rationalism were debunked, sometimes very entertainingly, very creatively by people like Voltaire and Thomas Paine and others of this nature, where, I believe in God and I believe in the possibility of a future life, says Thomas Paine in this book. I don't know, I can't remember, is it Vindication of Reason or The Rights of Man? One of those. He wrote it in France. He barely escaped the guillotine, by the way. They put the chalk mark on the wrong side of the door. He escaped and he got away and he came back to America. And he lived out the rest of his life in upstate New York, as I understand it. Nevertheless, he wrote this book where he debunked all the miracles in a very entertaining way, the resurrection, transubstantiation, all of that, in order to provide a way for people to still believe, only without this problematic albatross around the neck of all this non-rational content, which suddenly it lost its ability to be believed in. And so there was deism. It was in this context, of course, that William Blake issues some of his most beautiful and insightful kind of contributions to this dialogue, because he was not a deist. He knew where the gods lived. The gods lived in consciousness. Just like the Neoplatonists knew, the gods lived in consciousness, understood through the faculty of reason, but not the kind of reason that the dissectors speak of, or the devourers speak of, but the kind of reason that Plato speaks of, where one becomes sensitive to the pricklings of the feathers as they grow, or the different changes in the ways our thoughts think themselves as we learn more and more about certain subjects, or less and less about other subjects. To track that with intuitive awareness, that kind of reason, intuitive reason, William Blake learned from that, of course, from the great Thomas Taylor, a name there's a whole story there, of course. But also the Hermeticists, as I've mentioned. He was a deep reader in the great Hermetic mysteries, and a great and healing Hermetic thinker by the name of Jacob Boehme, or Jacob Beeman, this shoemaker, working class, like William Blake, even more so in the lowlands, Gorlitz. I don't know if it's Poland now or Germany. It probably is one century and the other another century, who saw light reflected off a pewter dish and saw a vision into creation and morality and manifestation and truth, but expressed it in the most non-academic terms you can imagine, yet the most rigorous and sincere and thorough and, dare I say it, gnarly. William Blake was gnarly too. And William Blake and Jacob Boehme, they are tight in this world and the next. I guarantee you that. But also then, that kind of writing, but rationalism, Hermeticism, divine vision, I don't know. But I guess what I want to come to is William Blake defended Thomas Paine another time. When Thomas Paine wrote this deism book, which, like I say, William Blake despised deism, and you could see right through it. He saw its rational, denatured basis, and yet the religionists, they despised this book also, and they had the power to do Thomas Paine real harm. And so when a certain bishop began to denounce, he was denounced wildly and widely for this. The deists loved it, but they were only a certain part of the societies and the cultures of Europe at that time. The many others just were against it to the point where, like I say, it was an autocratic society and things get brutal and very unfair. William Blake wrote, it's not widely known, but he wrote a beautiful and an incisive kind of critique. Well, is it really a critique, or was it actually just marginalia in the Bishop's book, where he condemned Thomas Paine up and down in oh so many ways? But William Blake defended him. William Blake was not defending deism. He was defending Thomas Paine, the deist's actual insight into things, even though they were expressed in terms that to William Blake were hostile to art and further development of thought. William Blake had the moral insight to know that Thomas Paine was more on the side of truth than was this bishop who was condemning him in so many ways. And so, well, that's just one more layer of thought that is in William Blake that we can understand and come to. So I better bring it to a peroration at this point in time. Let's have, the particle and the wave. The particle and the wave, the digit and the analog, the continual wave which changes and forms and flows, rough and smooth, broken and unbroken, and continuous somehow on its own terms through history, through time, through the imagination, and also as well as the particulate. Both are beautiful and important to Blake. The minute particulars, says William Blake. If you don't love the minute particulars, the commonplace things, how can you love the world? Nevertheless, there is the analog which provides the flowingness to the forms that you will use in your poetic utterances. And there are the particulates, the grit, the mote, the sand grain in the eye of the age that William Blake will sometimes present his poem as, on one layer, a denunciation of. So he says, for example, mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau, mock on, 'tis all in vain. You throw the sand into the wind, and the wind blows it back again. And every sand becomes a beam, reflecting the light divine. Blown back, they blind the mocking eye. But still, in Israel's tents they shine, the atoms of Democritus and Newton's particles of light are sands upon the Red Sea shore, where Israel's tents do shine so bright. Now, remember always when Mr. Blake speaks of Jerusalem and tents and Israel and shores, he is speaking of an inner understanding in biblical symbolic terms of his own cultivation of a higher spiritual reality. So, do not fall by the wayside of interpreting that necessarily as a political poem. Instead, imagine yourself upon such a shore, seeing such lines and waves and gatherings and settlements and places, and dealing with these things around you that are so common, like sand, and yet there's this wind, and the sand does one thing in one direction, and the sand does another thing in one direction, and then the sand itself is not to be thrown. As we say, it's not safe to throw sand. It could get in your eye. Instead, we trace lines in sand, like Jesus did, right? When he was asked a certain question, and he finished his drawing in the sand before he answered. Imagine it, tracing lines in the sand. What is sand but tiny dust grains? I wonder what he traced in the sand when he paused and looked up and said, "Let he among you who is without sin cast the first stone." Jesus is working with small stones, sand grains, to say true things about larger things misused, like stones thrown. So you see, at such a juncture, we are brought again and again when we're dealing with things in this particular way. Says William Blake, I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball, and it will lead you to Jerusalem's gate, built in to Jerusalem's wall. So trust that string, trace it carefully with your eyes. It's real, it's gold, and it takes you to the place. And what a place it is to be. Here, dwelling in our conscious habitation with the works of William Blake, such a radical thinker he is. Bless him and bless us. And I thank you for your heroic listening and staying with me through my ins and outs, these perorations. Yes, I thank you for your heroic listening. And may the good Lord bless us one and all and inspire us with vision. Amen.